And greetings to everyone on the call from a very cold and rainy Cape Town. I'm speaking today about the TRIPS waiver, something that's been on the agenda since October 2020, when India and South Africa first tabled a waiver proposal at the WTO. I think it's important to start with a recognition that COVID-19 dealt a reckoning to health systems that have been starved by decades of austerity, privatization, and commercialization. So on top of this, for almost 30 years now, the intellectual property rights codified in the TRIPS agreement have undermined equitable access to life-saving medical technologies. It's also important, I think, to acknowledge that we've been here before, most notably about 20 years ago with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which showed that TRIPS couldn't deliver on its promises that IP protections would promote innovation and tech transfer, particularly not to the Global South. It showed, in fact, that these IP protections codified in TRIPS could actively undermine public health measures during health emergencies. And so in response to this, and after a lot of pressure from the Global South, including the Africa Bloc, the Doha Declaration was issued in 2001. It was passed to remedy the constraints in implementing TRIPS flexibilities during public health emergencies. But sadly, we've seen over the last 2 decades that these flexibilities remain difficult to use. And as a result, most governments in the Global South today are forced to rely on philanthropic funding, donations, and differential pricing to increase access to essential medicines. And also, equally importantly, generics have played a key role in increasing, for example, access to ARVs. So what we face today is we're meeting in the shadow of an official death toll. Over the last 2 years of 6.3 million people estimated officially to have passed away due to COVID. Some estimates put this total as high as 15 million. And I think the key point to remember is that these deaths were avoidable. If people had been given access to life-saving COVID-19 technologies, we need not have been here today. At every level of the disease, there was a need for medical products which have been unavailable due to IP protections. So this includes masks like N95 masks, testing kits, medicines, medical devices, both small like small oximeters and big like ventilators, but also, and perhaps most importantly in the last year and a half, vaccines that could prevent morbidity and mortality. And it's important to note that these supply shortages were artificial. In other words, they were the direct result of monopolies created by the TRIPS agreement. It's resulted in vaccine apartheid. Today, less than 20% of people on my continent, the African continent, are fully vaccinated. And there's an ongoing risk of new variants emerging. In the global north, in contrast, the discourse has shifted and a lot of the framing, a lot of the discussions that we see are now about getting back to life after COVID. And so this is the context in which we're speaking. And I think it's important to think about, okay, so why the waiver request? As I mentioned, the waiver was originally tabled in October 2020. And it proceeded from the assumption that existing TRIPS flexibilities were too complicated to use during a health emergency. So that's why the request. Originally, and this is something the first speaker alluded to, the request was very extensive. It requested that 40 articles in the TRIPS agreement be waived. What we're looking at today, and I'll speak more about this in a little bit, is a waiver essentially that relates to only one article in the TRIPS agreement dealing with exports. So the initial waiver request was aimed at creating legal certainty, in other words, to assure people that wanted to collaborate in creating open science on how to manufacture a variety of COVID-19 interventions, that they wouldn't face political pressure or legal retaliation if they wanted to collaborate with other scientists, other governments to transfer technologies and scale up production to save lives, even if they were to do so in relation to products that were protected by patents and so forth. The original demand was for a full waiver on several categories of intellectual property rights. So patents, yes, but also things like copyrights, trade secrets, industrial design, and know-how. And the idea was that this would apply to 3 categories of interventions: vaccines, but also therapeutics or medicines, and diagnostics or tests for COVID-19. The original proposal was that it would apply for the full duration of the pandemic. What we're facing now is a debate of the scale of the application. There's a discussion still whether it should apply for 3, 5, or 10 years. But originally the proposal was for the duration of the pandemic. So I think what's really important to note is that along with India and South Africa, who originally tabled the waiver request, it was co-sponsored by 65 countries, and it had support from over 100 countries in the World Trade Organization. So a vast block of the membership supported this waiver request. So that was in 2020, October 2020. What's on the table now? Quite frankly, what's on the table now is a text that may do more harm than good, especially in terms of the precedent it sets in terms of interventions in future health emergencies. What we have is not a waiver, it's a proposal that doesn't waive almost anything, but instead it focuses on setting out how to use, by and large, existing TRIPS flexibilities. And this is in line with the EU's counter proposal to the original waiver tabled by South Africa and India. The EU is in opposition to that proposal, maintained that existing flexibilities are sufficient. And this is largely the point of departure of the existing text that's being negotiated in Geneva this week. So like I said, not a waiver, a restatement of existing flexibilities by and large. So what's even more unbelievable, I think, in the context of this pandemic is that the processes being discussed in relation to using flexibilities for COVID-19 products are even more complicated and onerous in the current text that's being discussed. So in other words, the current text is more difficult, more cumbersome to implement than if countries just stuck to the original TRIPS flexibilities. So what do I mean by this? One example is that the text, in terms of its non-waiver status, only addresses patent rights, but other forms of intellectual property rights are not addressed. So these other forms of IP rights would still undermine tech transfer. For example, when we look at Article 39, which focuses on trade secrets and know-how, what we have in the current text is basically a restatement of existing flexibilities. So there's some leeway on patents being proposed, but everything else is by and large the same. The current text that's being discussed limits exports of vaccines to countries that exported less than 10% of the world's vaccines in 2021. So what this means in plain language is that countries that already have the capabilities to produce and export large quantities of vaccines, for example, countries in the EU, UK, Switzerland, USA, China, these countries would be excluded from the waiver. In addition, the current proposal is that only vaccines should be covered, and this is in line with the US position that it tabled in, I think it was May 2021, which is a partial endorsement of the waiver, so that it would only cover vaccines. And the idea is that diagnostics and therapeutics would be excluded, but that there would be the option of negotiating a separate waiver on these products in the next 6 months, within the next 6 months. I think one of the things that's really important to note is that the current text says that the waiver, such as it is, or the text proposes that there'll be no waiver that applies to ingredients needed to make vaccines or any other inputs, or that it doesn't even cover the processes that are required to produce vaccines. So again, this is something that really limits the scope of what's being waived. And then I think one final thing that's really, really important to mention is that the current text actually makes it more difficult for governments to implement the TRIPS flexibilities. So For example, there's a new obligation that governments should identify all the patents that would impact their initiatives to make use of the waiver if it was passed. And of course, this is very difficult because many COVID-19 vaccines and diagnostics therapeutics are protected by thorny thickets of intellectual property patents that belong or that have been awarded to numerous entities, not just one company or one inventor. And so because of these patent thickets, some technologies would be very, very difficult to provide notification on. And then, of course, that's over and above that, there's the issue of some technologies not yet being patented, but they might be patented in the foreseeable future. And so basically it means that if governments want to make use of this waiver, they have to have a constant mechanism in place for scoping which new patents would be filed and which would apply to their efforts to make use of this waiver. So really a text that proposes in many ways an unworkable way forward, and in a way forward that's specifically unworkable in the context of a global health crisis, where governments are overburdened by responding to many of the issues other speakers have already flagged, including a massive food insecurity crisis, massive hunger crisis. So I think what's really important to keep in mind is that the current text that's being discussed in Geneva is not a waiver proposal. The text that's being discussed is a text that was leaked to the press in March of this year. It emerged to be a text that was drafted by the WTO Secretariat, and it's been the basis of the current negotiation process. What was a waiver proposal was the text that was tabled in October 2020 by India and South Africa. And despite the massive level of support, this text never served as the basis for negotiations or discussions at the WTO. So what's also worth mentioning in this regard is that organizations like TWN, for example, have reported that developing states have been silenced and marginalized in the negotiations happening at the WTO at the moment. So not only was the democratically or widely supported text sidelined and not used as the basis for discussion, but the more restrictive text, even in discussing that, developing states have not had an equal say. And so I think from a procedural point of view, that's really, really important to note the undemocratic nature of the discussion and of what's being tabled as the basis for discussion. So in closing, I want to shift focus to what do we want instead of what's being proposed. First, full use of flexibilities, existing flexibilities, and connected to this, no retaliation against countries that make full use of these existing flexibilities. Also important, it's important to ensure that the waiver is not only restricted to vaccines, but also to diagnostics and therapeutics, and also to the products and processes required to make these. In addition to this, governments have the power and should use it to publish technical information that's required to produce essential COVID-19 technologies. So again, therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. And in fact, this is important because the COVID-19 interventions that we have, and this applies to vaccines in particular, are the results of public funds. It's public money that's been used to produce this knowledge, to produce this technology. And so governments have an obligation to their citizens and to citizens of other countries to share this technology, to share this know-how, to assist technology transfer in a practical way. I think one of the things that's very, very important is to think about the fact that what we need with respect to health emergencies is an automatic suspension of intellectual property rights in future health emergencies. The proposal was tabled in October 2020. We're still discussing it 2 years down the line, and many people have needlessly died as a result. So an automatic suspension of IP rights in future health emergencies will hopefully help to avoid this. And then on the second last point, I think, and many people have spoken about the brokenness of the WTO, the undemocratic nature of its processes, about the cost in human suffering and lives. in many, many fields. And so what we want within the field of health is that the World Health Organization should be recognized as the lead international organization on all matters related to health, including health emergencies. WTO in the past 2 years has shown itself incapable of responding to the COVID-19 crisis. It's shown itself to be incapable of simply stepping out of the way, of simply not enforcing certain rules and regulations. And as a result, I would argue that it has shown itself not to be the desirable key health agency or key agency in the international ecosystem dealing with health. At this stage, it's unlikely that the original TRIPS waiver request will be tabled as a decision taken by MC12. It seems likely that this much more conservative text will be something that's forced to pass in the next few days. And in light of this constraint, this political constraint, I would think the kind of the most fundamental thing that many governments at WTO could do is to walk away and to say no to the text that's currently on the table. Because quite frankly, given how restrictive the text is, no decision is better than a bad decision, especially a bad decision that will set a precedent for the future.
How can we assure the protection of indigenous and fisher folk and all the vulnerable community rights in the present context, particularly Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh? So how can we protect the right, and particularly in an infrastructure project and the role of International Finance Institute? How can we pressurize to WTO? That is my question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ashok. That's the first question. We'll take a few questions and then I'll give all the panelists a final round of very quick comments to respond. Any other questions? No, there's Tony. Yes, please, Tony. Go ahead.
Thanks, Almali, and thanks to the speakers. I just want to add the importance of opposing the e-commerce proposals at the WTO. So primarily, for example, the issue on permanent moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmission of goods and services. I think I read an article or a news item that that would amount to like something like 32 billion US dollars. So that's a lot of money for gun revenues, in terms of gun revenues for our governments.
Yes.
So these big platforms are able to do business in developing countries without paying income tax. Of course, they pay income tax in their own countries, but not in our countries, even though they make money in our countries. So I think we should really oppose that. And there's another connected matter on why opposing that is very important, because they want to have it both ways. They don't want to pay tariffs, and at the same time they want to exempt e-commerce transaction by and large using the OECD and the G20. They're trying to come up with this elaborate architecture that I won't get into, but basically they want to exempt electronic commerce from being taxed. Just a final point. That's also a competition policy issue with regard to workers, with regard to MSMEs in our countries, in developing countries, because our own enterprises would have to compete against multinationals that are not even paying taxes. Thank you. Sorry for being long.
That's okay, Tony. Thank you. I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions, and I don't see any. So I give the floor back to the speakers. There was a question about protecting rights of peasants, indigenous, grassroots communities in global mechanisms and through global mechanisms. And then there's the issue of e-commerce competition policy and the unequal regulatory frameworks between transnational corporations and our domestic SMSEs. So let me start. What I'll do is I'll go back to the speakers in the same order that they speak, or maybe no, maybe I'll go back in the opposite order. So I'll start with Lauren and then we can end with Walden. And I request all speakers, if you either to respond to the question, and if you feel that you are not able to respond to the 2 points or 3 points that have been raised by the speakers, any closing remark that you would like to make in terms of demands and what you think the developing countries should be doing and what we should be doing as people in the face of this institution that has taken a lot of resources and created numerous, shall I say, unforeseen and foreseen crises for people. So what shall we do about this? So, but I request all of you to make very short, maximum 2-minute responses. So starting with Lauren, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think on the e-commerce question, maybe a broader procedural point, which is like e-commerce, like the joint statement initiative on trade in domestic services and a number of others. These are outside of the official agenda of the WTO. There's no legal mandate for them. And developing countries should not allow them to be tabled. I think what's important is that the priorities on the official agenda, which is supposed to be the Doha development agenda, that these should be spoken to. I think the JSIs basically propose to constrain the space that national governments have to have democratic oversight over areas of the economy that have significant consequences for health. So e-commerce, for example, there could be implications for data sharing, and in the context of greater moves towards insurance-based systems under the universal health coverage model. That might mean that a trade in data could constrain the kinds of health insurance policies that citizens have access to. Not that health insurance should be the premier model. We should have, in fact, public health systems. And this is something, for example, that the JSI on services could undermine. So these JSIs are procedural, and developing countries should push back against them, should refuse to acknowledge them. And then I think in terms of the TRIPS waiver, what's on the table is not a waiver. It's a TRIPS plus proposal, and it should be also, again, developing states should walk away rather than accept it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Again, I request all of you to please turn on your English interpretation to listen to Ka Pablo's closing comments, and also how to defend the rights of communities and indigenous peoples.
Thank you again for inviting me to speak here. What we want to reiterate now with the attempts to revive the WTO in relation to fisheries and all the other aspects of life, affecting all the other aspects of life. This is another tsunami facing us. So we're asking whether isn't it enough that we've already experienced all the problems and the failed promises, and now they're saying the WTO is the solution to crisis. So what I can say as on behalf of Pangisda is that the only defense to push for food sovereignty, to break away from poverty, will be the unity among the different sectors, the continued organizing among the fisher folk communities. We should continue to demand to governments to develop local industries, local agriculture, local fisheries, and the right of people to use natural resources, and we should fight for this right. We've already shown that the WTO is not interested in development, local industries, local fisheries, and even those in governments, including those in the Philippines, that only protect capital and profits of foreign companies, even if at the expense of the environment. So we're calling for broad unity. We need to work together. It's in our hands. Our future is in our hands. the future of our sector and all the population is in our hands to develop, to work towards sovereignty, food sovereignty, and sovereignty over our environment. Again, thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for inviting us here and a bit for allowing us to share our perspectives in our programs and demands of small fishers from the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kapablo. Thank you. Now we move to Sagri. Sagri, 2 minutes on defending rights.
Thanks,
and any other
Shalmali.
closing remarks.
I think it's very clear that the states and governments, knowing full well that, for instance, there are global commitments, there are national laws, every time these have been undermined, these have been broken. And within the space of WTO, what we have seen very clearly is the complete decimation, the complete destruction of indigenous people, of small marginal farmers, of women who are small marginal farmers and the landless, and not having kept a single, being able to even to stand up to your own laws. And therefore, I think the only way is outside of the WTO. We have to get out of there, that the WTO has to be dismantled. And as Pablo just spoke, I can only reiterate, it's about organizing, it's about getting, I think that process of one's own investigation, investigating into the roots of today's oppression and where the state really exists today. I mean, I think what happened, and I can just reiterate what I spoke about. It's important that we unmask the nature of the state. We unmask the nature of the state, and therefore, as people's movement are able to liberate, because then only can there be much more real, authentic organizing. And I think that's the only way forward. Yeah, Shalmali, I'll end there.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sagri. Farooq, over to you.
Yes, I would like to say that 15 years before, there was a declaration by United Nations on the right of indigenous people, UNDRIP, and 2007 it was approved. And that declaration must be obligatory in all countries, and that is a way forward to protect the right of indigenous people. And it's very important in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and so on, that we be in the forefront for the defense of the rights of the indigenous people. And that's a very important section and part of the farmers and workers community overall. I would also like to say that we must get rid of this WTO. We must not try to reform it. There's no way we can reform it. Reformation suggestions, all that would never be helpful to our movement. We have to build a strong movement of the workers and peasants together with the exploited classes, with the communities, with the women and youth movement, with the indigenous people. So we can build that movement in our own communities to fight for the rights of land, of work, of a dignified life. That's the only way forward. WTO is a big hindrance in our dignified life. So we must disband WTO. We should not try to reform it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Comrade Farooq. Now we go to Kate.
I mean, I really concur with the other comments that, first of all, the first battle, I guess, is to ensure that this particular ministerial doesn't adopt any harmful outcomes, and that would include a really compromised outcome on COVID. Won't be a waiver, but some other alternative compromised conclusion, because I think what we can't let the WTO get away with is trying to present itself as having facilitated a beneficial outcome. So I think that's really important, that we make clear that if it's a compromise, if it's not the original waiver, it's not just too late, it's harmful. Broadly, I think in relation to Indigenous peoples, but also and other social movements, also fundamental human rights, I think what we need is clarity in international law that should be very clear that the whole purpose of the UN, the whole framework of international law should be clarified to ensure that the UN Charter itself prevails when there's any inconsistency in international law, so that we know that that international trade rules should not be able to trump human rights, should not be able to trump the agreements states have made about the right to health, for example. And there's a range of proposals around that, how that should be made, but obviously one is to reduce the influence of the WTO, but also of other trade rules through bilateral, plurilateral trade agreements. And so I think that's critical at the global level. At the local level, obviously the answer is really only organising. This has all happened, of course, at the same over the last 30 years, you know, since the WTO came into fruition. The purposes, part of the purpose is to break the power of organised labour and organised movements. And so the only real response should be to organise. The example of the farmers in India is a good example of the way that it is still possible, despite the many, many constraints, to try and overturn harmful policy when groups are organised.
Thanks very much, Kate. Focus on the Global South has always claimed that the WTO is an illegitimate institution, and we have never sought reform. We have always sought a dismantling. Now, 27 years later, this institution is still stumbling along and being propped up by not just wealthy governments, but a number of developing country governments. So what is preventing the dismantling of the WTO? How do we dismantle the WTO? What's needed?
Let me say, first of all, that the remarks by the different speakers were extremely insightful. And I just wanted to first start with some comments on them. I think Lauren's warning, and which was also repeated by others, you know, that the negotiating text and the proposed TRIPS waiver is not really a waiver at all. That I think is the central thing that we must try to prevent from happening at this point, because it has many ramifications. The developed countries and the interests, the corporate interests that support these governments really want to get something out of this meeting, and it's not only with respect to the affirmation of the TRIPS for corporations and their protection, but they would like to wave something around and say, hey, look, we're not a dead organization. The WTO can in fact come out with an outcome. And I think it is extremely important to make sure it does not come out with any outcome at all. Because if it does not come out with any outcome at all and is prevented from coming out with some sort of declaration that tries to pass off an outcome that is really non-substantial, like something that emerges out of the negotiating text, I think that this will just prolong the life of this organization. So, so the important thing right now is just to increase the pressure in Geneva from all the different parts of people's movements to just make sure to block any outcome that comes out of this meeting. the second thing I would just like to say is with respect to the environment, with respect to fisheries, with respect to agriculture, I think it's fairly clear that the only position that we can all adopt is for the WTO to just get out of all these different areas and to make sure, that initiatives coming from the global north governments are resisted in terms of WTO's encroachment in these areas, as Kate has already said, and others have reiterated. You already have international organizations like the UN and others, and international agreements on human rights and environmental rights, that are far more important, effective, and relevant than the WTO. And this is why, for instance, in the case of fisheries, it is important to make sure nothing comes out of this meeting, because that will, even if it's just some sort of so-called, meeting of minds, and the WTO Secretariat is very good at sort of formulating meeting of minds, even if there's no agreement. This will just give the WTO legitimacy to move into this area where it really has no capability at all, no expertise, and certainly, is malevolent in terms of its intent. So when it comes to strategy, I think we all agree that the strategic end is really the dismantling of the WTO. It's being rendered ineffective. I think, as I said from the, in my presentation earlier, what we saw happen here was developing countries got bludgeoned into joining the WTO during the Uruguay round that, later in Marrakesh set up the WTO. What has happened is that because of overreach on the part of the developed country governments and their corporate backers, they triggered a kind of resistance in the succeeding years, in the next 20-25 years, that prevented any consensus on any major initiative in the WTO. The last one was in Bali in 2013, but that fell apart shortly thereafter. And I think that in terms of developing countries playing a defensive game, to some extent, they've been successful in the WTO from having any new corporate initiative being able to be translated into trade rules. That would be harmful. But my sense is probably it's now important to go beyond the defensive game to a more aggressive, offensive kind of strategy. And my proposal has been, that even as in the WTO, organizations, countries and governments keep on the defense, making sure that new initiatives like on e-commerce or in other areas are prevented from gaining consensus. They also move towards getting back the policy space that they yielded during the Uruguay round, because there was a lot of policy space, especially when it came to TRIPS, to trade-related investment measures, which the WTO destroyed any sort of trade policy. When it came to agriculture, there was so much policy space that was eaten up. So my proposal was that let's look at the current situation in which the WTO at this point in time, its dispute settlement mechanism is not working. And there are a number of reasons for that, including US unilateralism. It's really time to make use of the fact that you have a non-functioning dispute settlement mechanism to take back those policy spaces that the South yielded during the Uruguay round. Now, part of this, for instance, would be, hey, bring back quotas, and do away with this minimum access volumes. In terms of trade policy, bring back local content policies to help build industries, and of course, this would be controversial moves, but they should be taking advantage of the current crisis of the decision-making dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO. So my sense is that the concrete way of dismantling the WTO is by moving from just a defensive posture towards a more offensive one, and taking back the policy spaces that were yielded before. So this is a way of making concrete the dismantling of the World Trade Organization. The only other thing I would add here is something that Dr. Ramdas pointed out, which is, and this is a big danger with certain governments like that of India, is that to advance their own policies, they say, hey, the WTO wants, we are constrained, we have to follow the WTO, but really they know that the situation with the WTO is in crisis at this point, but they use the WTO as an excuse to push through favored neoliberal measures. And I think that's very dangerous at this point in time. We also have seen this, for instance, in the case of the Philippines. The Philippines did not need to eliminate the rice, the rice quota, but it pushed for its elimination, saying that the WTO required us to do this, instead of saying that, hey, look, the WTO at this point is in a very weak position. Why do we need to comply with the elimination of the rice quota? So my point is that Southern governments can be really two-faced, and we should really make sure, that neoliberal governments or neoliberal-leaning governments within the global South don't use the WTO as an excuse to push, their own preferred policies. And so I think that is what I'd like to end with. And again, I think that the interventions were extremely, extremely useful. And I feel, that we should maximize the pressure on the governments in Geneva to prevent any consensus on anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walden. And I thank all the speakers and all the participants who've joined us today. The message that we're sending to governments, our governments and all developing country governments in Geneva is very clear. Do not accept any proposal. Do not accept any watered down proposal. The WTO is not worth saving. Consensus is not really consensus. It's not worth having. And fight back, and we are watching. And this, non-acceptance of any watered down proposals, non-acceptance of compromises, which are really compromising the rights of the people of the world rather than just texts, are also to be monitored, and we will follow these up at the national levels as well. So our messages are to the governments are very clear, and we hope that they are listening. And we look forward to working with all of you again, marching, meeting, talking, strategizing, and working towards the dismantling of the WTO's trade regime and similar trade regimes, and building different public interest oriented governance frameworks from the ground up that are based on human rights and dignity and respect for the environment and the planet. So thank you again very much, and a big thanks from Global Focus on the Global South to all of you.